These slides will explain some research that I did with a professor at Northern Arizona University. This was several years ago. Yet it's an interesting project that looked at training in older adults. And this was done at NAU in Flagstaff, Arizona. NAU is fun because it's pretty high elevation, so it's like 7,000 feet elevation. And what we wanted, or what my professor wanted to test, was to look at um, strength training or resistance training in older adults. And if we did, fitness testing in older adults, we probably would not be doing like 1 RM squats or something that you young people do. Instead, there's different fitness tests for older adults. One such test is called the Berg Balance Test. And it's just a scale of 14 different tasks like standing um, on 2 legs, standing on one leg with your eyes closed. And so it's the scale to see how well people, older adults, can balance. There's also a timed up and go test. And this test is where someone is in a seated position, they stand up and they walk around an object that's 8 feet away, and then they come back down and sit down. And obviously, for you students, this would be easy to do and easy to do in a score of 14 seconds or in a time of 14 seconds. But for some older adults, like getting up and out of the chair, having enough balance to walk around, have enough leg strength to get out of the chair, those can provide some challenges. So this was a study I've done several years ago, and it was published in the Journal of Gerontology. And it's fun, it's fun to think about and interesting to think about. So um, eccentric training, and you probably have heard of this, but eccentric training is also called negative work, where the muscles are contracting, but they're contracting eccentrically, meaning they're generating force while the muscle lengthens. So if we think of, sort of these bicep curls, well, the lowering part of this biceps curls, that is the negative work, and that is when the biceps are actually doing eccentric muscle contraction, right? They are helping to slow down the weight that is being lifted up and then lowered. So trying to slow down that lowering of the weight. Saying if you would stand up and sit down, the sitting down portion, if you sit down slowly, that is eccentric muscle contractions. And benefits of this negative work, more force is required so you can get stronger. So that's a really nice benefit, especially in older adults who want to see strength gains. Also, there is less aerobic fitness required. So think about this. If you are, what's the aerobic fitness level of walking up a hill versus walking down a hill? Well, if you're walking down a hill, you're doing negative work, right? Your legs are doing eccentric muscle contraction to slow you down. But aerobically, it's easier to go down that hill. So eccentric muscle contractions are really nice. And they're a nice example they can be a real benefit for older adults. So the purpose of this study, I just cut and pasted it from the published paper, is describe the structural functional changes or impacts of a high eccentric muscle force negative work resistance training program on older adults. And what my colleague used was this really interesting bike that he developed. And it's like a recumbent bike, but it's not a recumbent bike that you would see in a gym or a fitness center where you're trying to do some cardio. This recumbent bike actually provides resistance as you're trying to push down on the pedals. So as these arrows are going down, you're trying to push down on the pedals. There's a computer and a resistance in here that is providing resistance back up. So, and then as you go through the pedal stroke, you've got to resist the pedal as it's coming back up. So it's an indoor bike, but it's an indoor like recumbent bike that provides negative work and provides the leg muscles to be able to do this eccentric muscle contraction. So they had 21 volunteers and their average age was 80. So here are older adults. They did some traditional weight machines, but they also did this recumbent negative work exercise bike. They trained 3 times per week for 11 weeks. So this was a good training program. And so real briefly, here are the results, and I'll show you some of the graphs out of the study. One thing is that the volunteers perceived this exercise to be somewhat hard. That's what they described it from weeks 3 to 11. So after they started off, they from 3 to 11, they said it was somewhat hard. But the exercise resistance kept increasing. So they were getting stronger. So they were doing more negative work. The computer program on this bike was resisting them more, but they still felt it was somewhat hard. So even though they were working out for 11 weeks and their resistance was increasing, there was little muscle soreness. And you probably know this, one issue with negative work, if you're like running down hills a lot, like your quads feel sore the next day. But these older adults, they still felt it was somewhat hard. They didn't think it was getting harder. So this is one of the figures from this paper. And these open bars are the perceived exertion. So how much they felt the work that they were doing. And so here are the open bars. And obviously they started off, if we look over on the left-hand side y-axis, they started off easy as any strength training program would be, and then it got harder and harder. But after week 3, they felt it was the same work. So where the cursor is, all these bars are the same. They felt it was the same work. But the black circles represent how much work they were actually doing. And obviously a good strength training program, they started off nice and easy. It got harder and harder, but it kept getting harder up to week 10 and 11. So they perceived it to be about the same, but the amount of work that they actually were doing was greater. So this next figure, and I've circled a couple things in this table, is that these older adults doing eccentric training got stronger. And so the experiment, they had an eccentric group and they also had a traditional group that did weight training using traditional machines. I want to focus on this post-training of just the eccentric group. So they're comparing pre-training to post-training. And all these little symbols like this asterisk and the little dagger represent that this value is greater than this value, but actually the little dagger or that little cross, um, uh, that also represents that there was a difference in the group, so between the traditional group. So they got stronger compared to what they started, and they got stronger compared to the other group. They also, these 80-year-old volunteers were actually willing to provide a muscle sample, and they actually measured the size of a muscle cell. So this is muscle fiber area, and it became bigger. Oh, that one test that I mentioned at the start of this talk, the timed up and go test, it went from 16 seconds to 11.96 seconds. So they got better at doing that timed up and go test from where they started, and they improved more than the traditional group did. And same with these other balance test and a stair descent test. This next graph will actually sort of represent some of this information, and specifically this timed up and go test. So I like the way they represented this graph, so I'll try to explain it. On the left-hand side y-axis is timed up and go in seconds, And here is a measurement of strength. So it's in newtons, but it's a measurement of isometric strength. Okay, fine. And there's two groups on here. The traditional group is represented by the circles. So they started here, and that was their timed up and go test, and that was their isometric strength, and they improved. So their timed up and go test was faster, and their isometric strength was greater. Uh, the eccentric training group that spent time on that bicycle, they improved more. So they're represented by the triangles. So here's where they started pre-test or pre-training program. And here's where they ended pre-training program. So their timed up and go test was much faster, under 12 seconds, and they developed more isometric strength. What they added into this graph is this line that is called high fall risk, low fall risk. So there's data out there to show that if an older adult does the timed up and go test slower than 14 seconds, they are at a greater risk of falling. So they may not have enough strength, they may not have enough balance, and an older adult falling, that can be really dangerous. They can break a hip and go to the hospital. Here in central New York, if it's, sort of bad weather or snowy or icy, they can, don't have as good balance, they can fall. So it's nice, it's good to be under this 14-second time because that is a lower fall risk. And these older adults that did this eccentric training program, their timed up and go test was now under 12 seconds. So they were in this low fall risk group. Um, so really interesting conclusions from this study. So an older population has the most to gain from exercise. Um, but in terms of how much exercise people get, only about 25% of older people get regular exercise. So we as professionals need to get more people exercising and more people lifting and doing appropriate lifting exercises. And so aging and being sedentary combined facilitates loss of physical capacity or physical activity. But a lot of people say, "Oh, I'm getting old," and so then they do less activity. But these 80-year-olds got stronger. So the human body can improve regardless of the age. So really interesting study about the positive effects of negative work.